Hello, and welcome. Tonight, we drift into the hush of the frontier, into cabins where the wind slipped through the cracks, into tents pitched under stars so wide they swallowed sound, and into the soft, strange rituals that helped weary souls fall asleep in the Wild West. This isn't the version told in dime novels, but the quieter truth of bedrolls shared by strangers, of night watches, and of the odd, inventive ways people tried to find rest in a world that rarely gave it. If you find peace in slow, gentle stories that breathe life into forgotten places, you're warmly invited to stay a while. And if you'd like to share where you're listening from tonight, feel free. It's a quiet comfort, imagining all of us falling asleep across the miles, together but apart. Now, settle your limbs. Let the day sink behind you, and come with me back to a time when dreams had to make room for danger, and when sleep came like a flickering lamp in the dark. The Midnight Watch. Why sleep was broken in the Wild West. They didn't sleep like we do now. There was no 8-hour stretch, no lull of central heat, no soft hum of distant traffic. In the Wild West, sleep came in fragments. Stolen moments wrapped in wool, punctuated by distant gunshots or the howl of coyotes. And no matter how tired a body was, you never let yourself sleep too deeply. Because on the frontier, the night belonged to the unknown. What if I told you that in many homesteads people slept in shifts, not because of babies, but because of fear? They called it keeping watch. Someone always stayed awake, especially on the edges of settlements, especially where there were still rumors of raids or strangers. Even the smallest cabins had someone sitting up by the fire, stoking coals, listening. Not every night, but often enough. And this meant that sleep came in pieces, 2 hours here, an hour there. Sometimes not at all. A mother might nap upright with a rifle resting across her lap. A child might fall asleep in the hayloft during chores, only to be shaken gently and handed a lantern because the cows had gotten loose again. And even when they could sleep, the beds weren't made for comfort. A straw tick mattress stuffed lumpy with dry grass. A wool blanket thick but itchy. Bedbugs, fleas, and lice were just accepted. You didn't complain about them. You complained when they were worse. Some families slept on animal hides, others on simple planks. And in winter they slept in every layer of clothing they owned, tucked tight beside one another, not for affection, but for warmth. In fact, the idea of personal space while sleeping was almost non-existent. Whole families shared beds. Guests were often invited, or rather expected, to share whatever space was left. Strangers might sleep back-to-back in a barn just to keep from freezing. And if a traveling preacher came through, you might end up giving him your place entirely, sleeping upright in a chair or huddled by the stove. And yet, somehow, people slept. Maybe not well, maybe not often. But they learned to let their bodies rest in slivers, heads drooping during supper, hands going still in mid-task. Children fell asleep beneath wagons, in fields by the fire. Adults stole naps whenever they could. They didn't wait for comfort, they just let sleep take them where it could. And dreams were considered something strange. If you had one, you mentioned it the next morning, but only if it seemed important. Many believed dreams were signs, warnings sometimes. A snake in your dream might mean a betrayal. A dream of fire could mean loss. Some claimed they dreamed of someone dying, only to learn it had happened miles away, the same night. Sleep wasn't just rest. It was a risk, a release, a ritual shaped by survival. And that's why so many people in the Wild West developed strange little habits. Rituals to coax themselves into sleep, or to protect themselves from what might come while they slept. We'll explore the bizarre bedtime routines people followed, from burying iron under the bed to tying knots in their hair, and why sleep in the Wild West always came with a little superstition. Iron under the bed. Superstitions that guarded sleep. They didn't trust the night. Not really. Not the silence, not the dark, not even their own dreams. So when it came time to sleep, many folks in the Wild West leaned on old superstitions, tiny rituals passed down from grandmothers and whispered between neighbors, meant to keep nightmares and worse things away. What if I told you people buried iron beneath their beds to keep evil spirits from crawling through the floorboards? A rusted horseshoe, a bent nail, anything forged in fire. It didn't matter if you believed in ghosts. You didn't tempt them. Children were warned not to sleep with their feet uncovered, not just because of the cold, but because spirits, or snakes, might find them first. Hair, too, was sacred. Some women braided their hair tightly each night, believing that if left loose, it could tangle with spirits in their sleep and drag them into the afterlife. Others placed scissors under their pillows, not to cut, but to sever bad dreams. These weren't just habits. They were armor, small gestures against a big, silent dark. But some tricks weren't about spirits at all. They were about staying warm, or pretending someone was still there. We'll curl up beside the fire and discover the strange objects people cuddled to sleep with, from bricks to Bibles to bundles of dried herbs. Bricks, Bibles, and bundles, what people slept with to feel safe. A warm body wasn't always available, and in the dead chill of a frontier night, comfort had to come from other places. So people reached for what they had, bricks pulled from the hearth, still hot and wrapped in cloth, or a family Bible clutched like a shield against the dark. What if I told you that in the absence of softness, people turned objects into companions? A heated stone might rest at the foot of the bed to keep toes from freezing. A worn wooden cross might be tied around the wrist to guard against bad dreams. Some slept with dried lavender or chamomile tucked under their pillows, not just for scent, but because they believed it kept sleep deep and death away. Children, especially, held tight to strange things: a worn spoon, a bit of cloth, a piece of their mother's apron. Toys were rare, but meaning was everywhere. Whatever was small, soft, or scented of home became sacred when night fell. These weren't just habits. They were survival. They were longing. They were love in another shape. But not all sleep came indoors. We'll step outside, to wagons, porches, and open fields, and explore how and where people slept under the stars, when they had no other choice. Under the stars, when the sky was your ceiling and the cold was a companion. Not everyone had a roof, and even those who did couldn't always trust it to hold out the night. Shingles came loose in prairie winds, canvas tore in mountain hail, and sometimes you simply weren't home. Your home was a wagon wheel, a blanket, and the slow breath of a horse standing guard nearby. In the Wild West, many nights were spent outside, beneath a sky so wide it made you feel both small and safe, like the stars might be watching over you, or watching you too closely. What if I told you that some people slept better under the open sky than they ever did indoors? That walls made some feel trapped, especially the ones who rode trails for weeks at a time, who only ever slept when the fire burned low and the coyotes kept their distance. The sound of wind through grass became a lullaby. The smell of smoke and saddle leather, the perfume of sleep. Cowboys often slept with their boots still on, not because it was comfortable, it wasn't, but because a stampede could start at any moment. Because snakes didn't wait for you to lace up your soles. Because sometimes a rider would wake to find his horse stolen, or worse, the fire gone cold and something breathing too close. They laid out their bedrolls slowly, carefully, a canvas tarp, rolled tight around a single wool blanket. If you were lucky, there was another for your head, bunched up like a pillow, and if you weren't, your saddlebag had to do. Your coat folded twice became a kind of hug, and it wasn't just cowboys. Families slept under wagons as they moved westward, too poor or too proud to stop for long. They'd cook over open flame, rock babies beneath pine branches, and huddle together when the wind picked up sharp from the hills. Children fell asleep on the ground, their faces smudged with soot, their fingers curled around sticks and pine cones like toys. Sometimes they spoke softly before sleep, stories about far-off cities, memories of a mother's kitchen. Other times they said nothing, just stared up until their eyes blurred, until the stars looked like a map they couldn't quite read. And even when they finally slept, their bodies remained half alert. A shift in the wind, a branch snapping, a cough too close. You never fully let go because the land didn't let you. But that doesn't mean it wasn't beautiful. There was something sacred in sleeping outside, in knowing the world wouldn't stop for you and deciding to rest anyway. A kind of bravery, a kind of surrender. Some wrote about it later, how the stars seemed brighter after a long ride, how sleep came easier when the sky wrapped around you like a second blanket. Others never wrote it down, but remembered. The way their mother's hand found theirs in the dark. The way a dog curled against their side, radiating heat. The way the grass sometimes whispered secrets if you listened just long enough. And when the rain came, you didn't curse it. You shifted, pulled the blanket higher, or let it soak through and pretended it was just part of a dream. You learned to live with discomfort. You learned to sleep around it, not wait for it to pass. Some used canvas shelters or lean-tos. Others found caves or crevices. But for many, the open ground was home. And with that came a different kind of silence. Not the silence of being alone, but the silence of being part of something larger. The land, the dark, the stars, time itself. And not everyone who slept outside did so by choice. There were the outcasts, the sick, the runaways, the widowed, people who had no one, no shelter, no fire. They curled beneath porches, beneath trees, beneath layers of shame and cold. Their sleep was not peaceful. It was survival, hour by hour. But even they, sometimes, found strange comfort. In the rhythm of the night, in the occasional warmth of a passing stranger, in the memory of a better bed, a softer time. And still others chose it. Chose the sky, the breath of wind, the song of insects. They couldn't stand walls, couldn't stand beds. Something in them had gone too wild to be boxed in. They walked the land and lay down wherever it grew soft. And when they woke, they didn't miss what they didn't have. Evening on the frontier wasn't about comfort. It was about quiet. And quiet, when earned, could be the deepest kind of rest. So, whether it was a child sleeping on burlap beneath a wagon, a cowboy curled around his rifle, or a widow lying awake beside a dying fire, the night had them all, folded together beneath the slow-moving stars. And in the West, when you slept outside, you weren't just under the sky, you were part of it. But not all nights ended in sleep. Some were broken by fear, by noise, by firelight flashing where it shouldn't. We'll step into the strange and unsettling world of night terrors, sleepwalking, and the eerie things people said and saw in the darkest hours on the frontier. Night terrors, sleepwalking, and the things that spoke in the dark. They called it the haunted hour. That part of night when even the bravest men stirred, blinking into shadows that moved wrong, or sounds that didn't quite belong. In the Wild West, night was never just night. It was a thin place, a stretch of hours where the veil between waking and dreaming seemed to flutter like a curtain in a storm. And in those long, hushed stretches between midnight and morning, strange things stirred inside people's minds, and sometimes outside them too. What if I told you that frontier families feared sleep as much as they craved it? Not because of bandits or beasts, though those came too, but because of what their own kin did when the world went dark. Men who rose from their blankets with their eyes wide open, moving like ghosts through their own cabins. Women who screamed in sleep, thrashing, wailing, calling out names no one had ever heard before. They didn't have words like sleep disorder or parasomnia. They just said the night had gotten into them, that some part of their soul wandered when the body lay still, and if it wandered too far, it might not come back quite the same. There were children who rose and walked straight out of the front door, barefoot in the frost, eyes open but unseeing. Mothers would bolt awake to the creak of floorboards, chasing after them in their nightgowns, scooping them up before they stumbled into the well or the creek. Later, the children would remember nothing, not even the dream that sent them walking. Just the weight of cold on their toes and a feeling like they'd been called by something far away. And then there were the night terrors. Sudden, shrieking wake-ups that jolted a sleeping room into chaos. A grown man crying out like a boy. A woman sobbing, gripping her chest, convinced something was sitting on her lungs. There were no explanations, just held hands, whispered prayers, and eyes that refused to meet in the morning light. Some believed these episodes were curses. Others said they were signs, warnings of bad luck, of death to come. One cowboy wrote in his journal that after 3 nights of terrible sleep, he refused to lie in the bunkhouse ever again. Said something breathed behind him each night, something that knew his name. Was it superstition? Maybe. But when sleep gets thin, everything else does too. The line between real and unreal, seen and imagined. And in the Wild West, where fear had room to grow, you didn't need much to believe in things that whisper at night. Others said it was just exhaustion, the kind that made your mind split open like cracked leather. Sleep deprivation was common. Riders would go for days without real rest, and when they finally dropped, their dreams turned fevered. They saw people they'd lost, heard voices they hadn't heard in years. Sometimes they spoke out loud, whole conversations with folks who were long gone. There were tales of people waking up with scratches they couldn't explain, of men who slept with knives in hand and sometimes woke up holding them, breathless and afraid. Of rooms where no one could sleep, no matter how many times the bedding was changed or the mattress burned. Of dogs who refused to enter certain corners after dark. Of lullabies sung in empty rooms. Even the most rational settlers had their limits. They might laugh in the daylight, dismissing ghost stories and bad dreams. But at night, when the wind moaned and the fire burned low, then they wrapped their blankets tighter, kept one eye half open, said their prayers twice, and when someone had a bad night, a real bad one, people remembered. A young bride who woke screaming every night after her first winter. A trapper who refused to sleep indoors, saying the walls closed in while he dreamed. A preacher who started locking his door from the outside. "So, the Lord can't get in," he whispered once, before covering his mouth like he'd said too much. There were no doctors to explain it. No pills to take. No names for what unspooled in those sleeping hours. Only survival. Only the dawn, if it came. And so people made their own sense of it. Called it ghosts. Called it grief. Called it the price of living too close to the edge of the world. But not all strange sleep was born of fear. Sometimes people went looking for it, invited it, tried to touch the dream world on purpose, hoping to see something they couldn't find in daylight. We'll step into the stranger corners of Wild West belief, where people drank strange teas, burned herbs, and tried to dream themselves into visions, hoping to see the future or speak to the dead before morning light returned, dreaming with smoke and herb. How Wild West folk tried to speak with the beyond. Some called them dreamers. Others called them mad. But out on the frontier, where the land was wide and empty and the sky never quite let go of the stars, some folks didn't wait for sleep to come naturally. They chased it. They courted it. They brewed it into tea and burned it into the rafters, hoping to catch a glimpse of something on the other side. Of what, exactly, no one ever agreed. Some said spirits. Some said the future. Others said it was just peace. What if I told you that sleep, for some people in the Wild West, wasn't just about rest? It was a doorway. A place to meet lost children, get warnings from the beyond, or feel the presence of something greater than themselves. And to get there, they turned to the old ways, the forgotten ways, the ways whispered down from grandmothers who still remembered which herbs to burn and which ones to bury. Mugwort, for visions. Valerian, to quiet the noise. Dried sage tied in bundles to drive out restless spirits. Lavender for peace. Poppy for forgetfulness. They didn't always call them by name. Some just called it sleep smoke, a mixture wrapped in cloth, lit slow, and left to curl around the room as the fire dimmed. People would sit in silence as the air thickened, heads bowed like in prayer. Some claimed they could dream deeper that way, see things clearer. A woman in Nevada swore she dreamed of her brother's death days before the letter came. A boy in Wyoming claimed he saw his future wife's face one night after sleeping on a pillow stuffed with mint and ash. These stories weren't rare. They were part of the rhythm of things. In places where death came suddenly and often, the idea of speaking with those who'd gone wasn't terrifying. It was comforting, a second chance, a soft goodbye. And it wasn't just herbs. There were chants, too, words repeated softly before bed. Or charms tucked under pillows, bits of hair, a broken button, a drawing burned into the inside of a trunk lid. Rituals to guard the dreamer, to invite something in, to keep something out. Some people kept dream journals, not in leather books, but scratched onto firewood, or marked in symbols on the back of cupboard doors. One woman, known as Sweet Annie, carved a series of marks into her cabin floor, one for each dream she believed had come true. By the time she died, the floor was covered, and some went even further. Sleep fasting. No food for a day or two, then lying beneath the stars in total silence, hoping the body would slip past waking and into something else. The Blackfeet and other indigenous peoples had long traditions of vision quests, a sacred search for meaning through dreaming and endurance. But settlers, too, often without understanding, borrowed these ideas in clumsy, quiet ways. And then there were the ones who claimed they could guide others, dreamwalkers, whisperers, women with cloudy eyes who never married, who lived at the edge of town and were said to talk in their sleep to people who weren't there. People visited them for potions, for herbs, for answers. Not everyone believed, of course. Skeptics laughed. Preachers warned. But even the doubters slept a little easier with a bundle of herbs above their doorframe. Just in case. Dreaming wasn't soft in the West. It wasn't always sweet. It was something raw, powerful, frightening sometimes. Like pulling on a thread and not knowing what would unravel. And yet they did it. Again and again. Because they wanted to understand. Because they wanted to feel something they'd lost. Because in the absence of certainty, mystery was better than nothing. And sometimes the dreams told them what they needed to know. About planting, about danger, about which path not to take. Was it coincidence? Was it intuition? No one could say for sure. But people lived by them, died by them too. And even those who never dared to chase the dreams still lived with them, and whispered morning stories, in sideways glances at breakfast, in the way a man might go quiet when he woke, eyes far away, and mutter something about needing to ride into town. Because, whether welcomed or not, dreams were part of life. Like wind, like dust, like silence. But sleep wasn't always so mystical. Most nights, it was about exhaustion. Work, bone-deep tiredness. We'll step into the final hours of the Western workday. How people prepared for bed, what they ate, what they wore, and how the body learned to let go after a day of brutal labor under the sun. When the day finally let go. How sleep came after work in the Wild West. By the time the sun dipped low and the last chores were done, sleep wasn't a luxury. It was a surrender. It wasn't soft and it wasn't easy. But it came, because the body had been pushed, bent, blistered, baked by sun, soaked by rain. And when that body lay down, wherever it could, it didn't need lullabies. Just stillness. Just the promise of not moving for a while. What if I told you the hardest part of sleep in the Wild West wasn't falling into it? It was earning it. Because no one sat around waiting to be tired. They were tired before the stars even came out. The work began before sunrise and didn't end when the sun went down. It only slowed, just enough for someone to sit by the fire and finally unlace their boots with trembling hands. For women, the day didn't end with supper. It ended when the dishes were scrubbed, the bread was set to rise, the water was brought in, and the fire was banked for the night. Only then would they loosen their hair, roll down their sleeves, and maybe, just maybe, sit for 5 quiet minutes in the dim glow of the hearth before pulling the children into bed. For men, it was the soreness that told them the day was done. The kind that crept from spine to shoulder, the ache in fingers too tired to roll a cigarette. The way they lowered themselves onto a blanket, not slowly, but with a kind of resignation, like sinking into something they wouldn't escape until dawn. There were no pajamas, no rituals of brushing teeth or soft music or candles. Most slept in their work clothes, or in a patched-up linen shirt that doubled as every other garment. A bath was rare, a bucket if you were lucky, a stream if you were near one, or nothing at all if the frost was too deep. And yet, there were moments, quiet ones, where people found something close to grace in the stillness. A man sipping one last mouthful of black coffee before blowing out the lantern. A child curling up beside her sibling, whispering stories made up on the spot. A woman tucking a comb beneath her pillow like it was the only thing in the world that belonged to her. Some read scripture before bed, their fingers tracing verses by memory in the dark. Others sat silent, just staring into the coals, letting the quiet soak in. There was no background noise, no hum, no cars, no ticking clocks, just wind, just breath, just the soft creak of timbers and the pop of a dying fire. And if there was food before bed, it was simple. A crust of bread, a cold potato, sometimes a sip of whiskey to take the edge off. No one went to bed full, but they went to bed fed enough. The bed, if there was one, was shared. Families slept packed in, 3, 4 to a bed. Sometimes more. Babies on bellies, children at feet. No one minded the crowd. Warmth mattered more than privacy. Even in towns, boarding houses offered little privacy. You might share a room with strangers. Hear every cough, every creak, every dream mumbled out loud. Curtains hung between bunks if you were lucky. If not, you simply turned your back and tried to disappear into yourself. Still, even after the roughest days, sleep didn't always come easily. A wound, a worry, a noise in the distance. The mind might still spin while the body begged for rest. Some would talk to the dark, not praying, not really, but muttering their thoughts like casting them out into the night. Others would rock, gently, side to side. There was no name for it, but it soothed. It worked, and then the breathing slowed. The limbs went heavy. The fire faded. And sleep, stubborn as it was, finally arrived. It wasn't always deep, it wasn't always safe, but for those few hours, the world paused. The body repaired, the heart softened. Sleep, when it came, was a mercy. But even in sleep, not everyone stayed put. Some had to rise again, long before the sun. We'll wake early, to explore who kept watch while others slept, who rose before dawn to light the fire, and how the first stirrings of morning broke the spell of the Wild West night, before the sun knew. The ones who rose first in the Wild West. Long before the sky began to pale, before the rooster stretched its throat, and while the last of the stars still flickered faint and cold, someone was already awake. Always. In every cabin, homestead, saloon, or bunkhouse, there was someone who stirred before the day officially began, because in the Wild West, the morning didn't wait for anyone. And if you weren't ahead of it, it ran right over you. What if I told you that the first sounds of the day weren't birdsong or breakfast, but flint against steel, the scrape of matches, the puff of breath into coals? The fire had to be coaxed back to life before anything else could happen. It had to be warm before coffee, before light, before waking the others. And that quiet moment, that ritual of relighting the world, belonged to a very specific kind of person. It might have been the mother, the cook, the ranch hand, the youngest daughter, the stable boy, the one who'd drawn the shortest straw the night before. Whoever it was, they moved through shadow, not to wake the others, but to prepare the day. With hands still stiff from sleep, they split kindling, poured cold water into a blackened pot, and moved like ghosts across wooden floors that creaked no matter how gently you stepped. Some mornings were kind, some weren't. In summer, you'd hear the first stirrings of cattle and the whisper of wind in the grass. But in winter, rising before dawn meant numb fingers and breath that puffed white indoors, ice in the basin, frost on the windows, if you even had windows. Sometimes, before doing anything else, the early riser would hold their hands over the fire and whisper a curse or a prayer, or both. And once the fire caught, the rhythm began. Water on the boil. Bread reheated. Coffee grounds dumped and stirred. Maybe a piece of salt pork sliced with a dull knife, or oats scooped from the same tin they'd used all year. Quiet, efficient, slow. In towns, it was the innkeepers and saloon hands who rose first. They'd sweep the floors, relight the lanterns, dump out the slop buckets, and set chairs upright. They'd mop the last of the blood, or spilled whiskey before the sheriff made his first round. And if a patron had passed out in the corner, they'd step around him like furniture, let him sleep until the sun did the waking. On farms, the first riser often didn't sleep much at all. They went from dusk to dawn to dusk again. They didn't think about it. They just moved. Feed the animals. Check the traps. Milk by lantern light, hands frozen around the pail. Sometimes it was a child who rose first, not because they wanted to, but because their father or mother shook them gently by the shoulder and whispered, "It's time." These were not romantic mornings. There was no sunrise sipping, no slow stretch and smile, just duty, just the unspoken understanding that if someone didn't start, nothing would start. And when the others did begin to stir, they found coffee waiting, or warmth, or silence already broken by the creak of the day beginning. And sometimes they never noticed who made it happen. The first riser faded back into the rhythm like a match struck and burned out. But there was something holy about it, being the one who brought the world back from the edge of sleep, who lit the fire, who boiled the water, who made the day real again. Those small, thankless gestures were a kind of quiet love for family, for work, for survival. And when the light finally bled across the horizon, pink and soft, it didn't always feel like a reward. Sometimes it was just the sign that the hard part was over. Sometimes it meant relief. Other times it meant the real labor had only just begun. And just like that, the spell of night broke. The dream world folded back into the corners. Sleep became a memory, and the day, loud, bright, impatient, took its place. But the habits of sleep never really left them. Even when awake, the people of the Wild West carried bits of the night in their bones. The quiet, the caution, the dreams they hadn't fully shaken. We'll step out of the night entirely and look at how the strange sleep customs of the Wild West followed people into their waking lives, shaping how they worked, how they trusted, and how they dreamed, even with their eyes wide open, sleepwalking through the day. How night habits haunted the waking hours of the Wild West. Sleep never really ended. Not completely. Not out here, where the days were long, the silence was wide, and the edges of waking and dreaming bled into one another like the light at dawn. In the Wild West, people didn't just carry tiredness on their backs, they carried the habits, the hush, and the ghost of night inside them, like a secret they never fully woke from. Even as they moved through the sunlit hours, something of the dark remained. What if I told you that the way people slept shaped the way they lived? That a man who kept watch for too many nights learned to glance over his shoulder without even knowing it? That a woman who woke 5 times each night to nurse her children began to speak in whispers by instinct, even at noon? That a child who learned to fall asleep afraid never quite learned how to rest? Not really, even with both eyes open. The night wasn't just something that happened while the world paused. It changed them, it rewired them, and in some quiet, invisible way it followed them into the light. You could see it in the way people moved, slowly, deliberately, as if every action was performed underwater, not because they were lazy, but because the body, used to conserving itself, never fully unwound. The sudden movement of a door, the crack of a twig, the sound of a cough in the wrong place, these things pulled people back into alertness, like waking from a dream they hadn't meant to leave. People learned to work without fully waking. Ranch hands who nodded off while sharpening tools, cooks who stirred stew with one hand and rested their head against the wall, men who napped sitting upright in saloons, eyes half open, arms crossed like they were holding something precious that no one else could see. They didn't call it sleep deprivation. They just called it life. Called it the price of keeping going. Because even if you got your hours, even if you somehow found 6 or 7 hours of quiet rest, the body never truly relaxed when it didn't trust the dark. And the Wild West didn't offer trust. It offered land and labor and freedom and fear, all tangled together in something that never let you put your guard fully down. And so, sleep trained people to live in a different rhythm, one shaped by watchfulness, interruption, repetition. A man might stop in the middle of the field and stare for a long minute, not at anything, just letting the stillness fold around him. A woman might pause in the kitchen, her hands still in dough, her eyes closing for just a second, remembering something she saw in a dream or something she wished she had. People talk to themselves more than you'd expect. Not loudly, not like madness, more like murmuring. Half sentences, half prayers. Words meant to fill the silence that used to be night. They muttered about fences, about goats, about how many beans were left. But underneath that, they were talking to the pieces of themselves still stuck in the quiet hours before the sun rose. And there was a kind of dream logic that followed them through the day. They believed in signs. They believed in gut feelings. They followed hunches more than plans, because they had learned again and again that the world could change overnight, that sleep wasn't a reset, but a reshuffling. You might wake to fire, or frost, or a new death. So, during the day, they listened for the rhythms they'd picked up at night. A creak that felt wrong, a breeze that felt too cold, a look in the eye of a neighbor that said more than words ever could. Some believed that certain dreams leaked, that if you saw something too vivid, too strange, you might bring it with you, carry it like a weight through the hours, unable to shake the feeling that something was waiting just outside the edge of your sight. A bad dream meant caution. A good one meant hope. Either way, they watched the world differently after sleeping. And then there were the rituals, the leftovers from bedtime that stayed through breakfast and beyond. Some folks wouldn't drink from certain cups if they'd dreamt of someone who had died. Others kept the same scarf around their neck until the feeling of the night had passed. Some refused to look in mirrors before noon. Others burned leftover bits of the herbs they slept with, letting the smoke trail behind them like a charm, like a way to carry calm forward into the harshness of the day. Even children weren't immune. You could see it in the way they played, recreating dreams in the dirt, retelling them as stories while skipping rope or digging holes. One boy in Colorado was known to walk in circles for hours after a strange dream, convinced it would undo something bad. His parents didn't stop him. They said it helped him sleep later. Because out here, no one questioned the strange rhythms people made for themselves. You did what you had to rest, to rise, to hold yourself together after another night in a world that didn't promise softness. Even in church, you could see it, people nodding off mid-sermon, not from boredom, but from the exhaustion that crept in no matter how clean their shirt or how holy the hymn. Preachers didn't call them out. They knew. Everyone knew. That sleep had its own power, its own cost. And still, life continued. Bread was baked. Horses were saddled. Fences were mended. Even with sleep stitched sloppily through their days, the people of the West kept moving, like dreamers walking across a burning plain, too stubborn to stop, too tired to think, too alive to sleep for long. But even the most exhausted soul held tight to one thing, the hope of rest. Not the kind you steal in midday or fold into your saddlebag, but the full kind. The kind that cradles you, the kind that lets you forget. That hope kept people going, one heavy step at a time. And that's what made the next part of the story so human, because even in a world that asked for everything, people still tried to create comfort, even luxury. We'll explore the rarest of Wild West sleep experiences, when people went out of their way to build comfort into the night, from feather beds to bath rituals, from perfumed sheets to handmade pillows, and why sleep, even in a brutal land, was sometimes treated as something sacred. Feather beds and perfumed sheets, when sleep became a luxury in the Wild West. Not everyone in the Wild West slept rough. Not always. For all the images of straw mats and saddle pillows, of fire-warmed stones and blanketless nights under stars, there were also those who, in their own quiet way, turned sleep into a kind of ritual, a private rebellion against the dust and the cold. For them, rest wasn't just recovery. It was an act of dignity, a soft moment in a world that was never designed to be soft. What if I told you that in a land known for its hardship, there were people who slept in lavender-scented beds, beneath quilts hand-stitched over the course of a year, with ivory combs and rosewater nearby? It wasn't common, but it was real. In upstairs bedrooms behind general stores, in the private quarters of town matrons, in the finer homes of saloon owners and traveling judges. Comfort wasn't everywhere, but where it existed, it glowed like a lantern behind lace curtains. It began with the bed. Most were nothing more than wooden frames, a tick mattress stuffed with straw or feathers, and a few worn quilts. But in the homes of those who could afford it, or those who cared enough to save, the bed was sacred, iron-framed, creaking with weight, plumped high with stuffed bolsters, covered in linens washed in lye and sometimes perfumed with lavender or peppermint oil, dripped sparingly into the rinse water. The pillows, when they existed, were kept fluffed and rotated with care. The mattress turned each season. Some women took pride in their bed-making, smoothing out creases with palms, tucking corners tight, dusting the surface with a tiny flick of cloth. It wasn't for anyone but themselves. After a day spent among cattle, children, or customers, this was the one place where control could return, a small, square kingdom of peace. Some slept with trinkets under their pillows, a locket, a love letter, a pressed flower from a place they'd never get to go back to. Others tucked rosary beads into the folds, or Bibles small enough to fit in the palm, their pages worn soft with repetition. For them, these were not objects. They were anchors, holding the sleeper in place against the tide of dreams or the uncertainty of what tomorrow would bring. And the rituals didn't stop there. Some women brushed their hair exactly 100 times before sleep. Not vanity, but habit, inherited from mothers who did the same. Others would wash their face with rose water, just a drop in a chipped bowl, then dry it with linen that had been sun-bleached on the line. The effect was more emotional than physical, a way to signal the body that the day had ended, that the skin could rest, that it had done enough. Some men, too, had their quiet routines. They'd oil their boots one last time before placing them neatly beside the bed. They'd check their revolver, not out of fear, but tradition. They'd unbuckle their belt with a sigh and hang their hat at the same angle every single night. In these motions there was a kind of prayer, a quiet hope that tomorrow would begin the same way, with their boots exactly where they left them, with the gun unfired, with sleep uninterrupted. Baths, rare though they were often timed for nightfall, not to start the day clean, but to end it that way. In towns, you might pay a few cents for hot water at a bathhouse, the steam rising in wooden tubs while you scrubbed away the ache. In homes, a tin basin by the fire, filled slowly with boiled water. The warmth was brief, but it lingered in the bones just long enough to carry you into sleep. And if there was luxury, it came not from money, but intention. A fresh bar of lye soap wrapped in a handkerchief. A brush with every bristle still in place. A cotton nightdress mended neatly at the seams. Comfort in the West wasn't about extravagance. It was about carving softness from the hard, day by day. But not everyone with comfort came by it honestly. Brothel madams, for instance, often lived better than the schoolmarms or midwives. Their rooms above saloons were among the only places in town with thick rugs, proper mattresses, velvet curtains. But that comfort came with a price. Long nights, endless strangers, the knowledge that no lock could stay closed forever. And so they made sleep a performance. Slippered feet, satin robes, perfume behind the ear, even when no one was watching. A performance for themselves. A moment to pretend the world was gentler than it was. Even outlaws and gamblers, when flush with winnings, found their way to comfort. Renting the best room in town. Ordering fresh sheets. Bathing by lamplight and stretching out in borrowed silk. It never lasted. But for that one night, that stolen evening between bloodshed and flight, they could sleep like kings. Because comfort, in the West, was always temporary, always fragile. A bed could burn, a room could be taken, a loved one gone by morning. And so, for those who had it, sleep was never taken for granted. It was revered, Even children learned this reverence, told not to jump on the bed, not to wrinkle the quilt, to say their prayers and smooth the pillow before laying down. Sleep was treated like a guest, something you invited with clean sheets, quiet hearts, and maybe, just maybe, a tiny slice of peace carved out from the rough world outside. And in the morning, when eyes blinked open and dreams retreated, that comfort faded fast. The quilts folded, the basin emptied, the boots pulled on again. The West waited. The dust returned. But for those few dark hours, they had made something holy. A nest, a hush, a shelter from the endless, unraveling road. Because no matter where they came from, no matter how far they had to ride, the people of the Wild West knew. If they could sleep well for even one night, they could rise and face the next day. And yet, there was one last kind of sleep the West knew better than most, the one that came not with morning, but with mourning. We'll walk quietly into the ways people honored death during sleep, the passing in the night, the dreams that warned of it, and how the final sleep shaped everything that came after. The final sleep, death in the night and dreams that warned of it. There was always a silence that settled heavier than the rest, deeper than a hush, thicker than the dark. A stillness that meant someone wasn't waking up. In the Wild West, where life moved hard and fast and sleep came in restless fits, death often arrived in the quietest way, in the middle of the night when no one could stop it and no one could say goodbye. They called it passing in the sleep, though the truth was never quite so simple. What if I told you that many believed the soul could slip away more easily at night? That the veil between life and whatever came next was thinnest in those quiet hours after midnight, before the rooster, before the wind returned. People whispered that the dead liked the dark, not because they were cruel, but because it was gentle, because it gave them privacy, because it was soft. And often there were signs. A sudden chill in the room, the candle snuffing itself out. A dream, strange and vivid, of someone standing in the doorway or sitting by the bed, not speaking, just watching. A dog howling for no reason. A clock stopping. Bread falling off the shelf without anyone touching it. Little things, but too many to ignore. Those who had lived on the land the longest, the midwives, the grave diggers, the widows, they knew the signs. They'd look at the dying and say, "It'll be tonight," not with fear, just with truth. And sometimes they were right. When someone died in the night, it changed the whole rhythm of the place. The house didn't wake like it used to. The morning didn't come in the same way. People moved slower, softer, as if trying not to disturb what was already gone. A blanket left folded, a pillow still indented, a teacup unwashed. There was no screaming, no wailing, just quiet. Just the kind of silence that means something sacred has left the room. And yet, for those who'd witnessed it, those who'd slept beside the person or tried to shake them awake, the moment was something they never forgot. A final breath so faint it could be mistaken for a sigh, eyes fluttering, then still, or sometimes nothing at all, just waking up and knowing, somehow, that the world had changed. A husband gone, a sister still, a mother whose hand had cooled in yours while you slept. And then came the rituals, the soft preparations. They'd wash the body gently with warm water and care, close the eyes, tie the jaw with cloth so it wouldn't fall slack, comb the hair, smooth the sheets. Sometimes they'd lay silver coins on the eyes to keep them shut. Sometimes a Bible on the chest to guide the soul onward. The bed became a shrine. Flowers were placed. Windows were opened, no matter the weather, to let the spirit out. No one dared shut it in. Children were kept back. The room was quiet. And in the kitchen, Coffee was brewed stronger than usual, strong enough to carry grief. Some said the soul lingered for a while, that for a few days after, you might hear footsteps or feel someone sit at the edge of your bed just before you fell asleep. Not haunting, not quite, just visiting, saying goodbye. And then there were the dreams, people who claimed the dead came to them, not to frighten, but to comfort, to speak in images, to say what had gone unsaid. A mother who dreamed her husband was walking through wheat fields, smiling. A boy who saw his sister sitting by a stream, humming the lullaby their father used to sing. Some dreams were gentle. Others left the dreamer weeping before they even woke. And there were warnings, too. Dreams that came before death. Of dark rivers, of silent rooms, of strange birds circling overhead. People would wake and feel it in their chest, the knowing. They'd check on their loved ones more closely that day. They'd sit a little longer by the bedside. And when death came that night, they weren't surprised. Just sad, just ready. Not all deaths were peaceful, but those that happened in sleep were honored. They were seen as merciful, a passing without pain, without panic. People would say, he went easy. She slipped away like smoke. And there was envy in that sometimes. Quiet envy. That the last breath came without a struggle. But grief lingered. In the bed left half full, in the echo of snoring that would never come again. In the soft things, the nightshirt folded neatly, the slippers untouched. The smell of the person that remained, long after they had gone. Some kept the bed untouched for days. Others stripped it clean before the sun rose. Neither was wrong. Both were acts of love. And so the bedroom, the space of sleep, became something more. A cradle for life. A harbor for death. A place where memory softened and rose again like breath. Even children learned what it meant to go gently. They asked, "Did Grandma go to sleep?" And the answer was always, "Yes, she did. She's resting now." Not a lie, just a gentler truth. In time, someone else would sleep in that bed. Life didn't stop, but it always paused for death. The night would come again, and another body would curl into the same shape, sighing into dreams that didn't quite belong to them. Because in the Wild West, sleep wasn't just for the living. It was a thread stretched between this world and the next. And every time someone closed their eyes, they touched both. And yet, for all its weight, sleep still held sweetness. Still offered stories, comfort, closeness. We'll finish our journey by curling back into the gentler side of Wild West sleep. The lullabies, the bedtime stories, the whispered prayers and promises that helped people of every age drift off into rest, again and again. Lullabies and lantern light, the gentlest good nights of the Wild West. For all the fear, the roughness, the cold nights spent in silence or fear or mourning, there was still tenderness in how people fell asleep. Because even in the hardest places, the human heart longed for gentleness. And in the Wild West, where comfort was scarce and safety never guaranteed, people made their own quiet rituals, stitched from song and story and touch. Not because they had time for it, but because they didn't. And that made it sacred. What if I told you that the same calloused hands that held rifles, chopped wood, and stitched wounds also braided hair before bed, rocked babies on porches, and sang lullabies in broken voices that trembled more from love than tune? That under the same roofs where death came suddenly and work never ended, someone was always humming, soft, low, and steady, to help another soul slip gently into sleep. Lullabies were rarely written down. They weren't composed. They were passed like recipes, remembered by rhythm, not by rhyme. half whispers of Ireland and Scotland, of Germany and Africa and Mexico, carried westward in wagons sewn into the hem of memory. Go to sleep, little darling. Go to sleep. Don't you cry. Words that had seen 100 dawns and still made sense in this new land. Fathers sang, too, not just mothers. And often their voices cracked, rough from dust, deep from silence, but tender. Because the land might ask them to shoot, to fight, to build, to ride, but for those 5 minutes in the dark, all it asked was that they stay. Stay beside the cot, or the blanket on the floor, or the child curled into the crook of their arm. And hum. And the stories. Oh, the stories. They weren't fairy tales, not exactly. They were half true, half false, stories built from what they remembered and what they wished had been. Tales of brave girls who rode wild horses, of boys who outwitted bandits, of talking owls and coyotes who stole stars. No books were needed, just memory, voice, and the spark of imagination glowing like a coal between sentences. Some stories were told again and again. A child would fall asleep midway through, knowing exactly what happened next, but needing to hear it anyway. Not for the ending, but for the sound of their father's voice or the warmth of their mother's hand resting on their forehead. And there were prayers. Quiet, personal, whispered into blankets. Not sermons, but promises. Keep us safe tonight. Let the fire stay lit. Don't let the baby's fever come back. Words stitched with hope and fear, and just enough faith to fall asleep. Children learn to say their own. Not always with understanding, but with rhythm. With trust. Now I lay me down to sleep, murmured like a spell against the dark, the unknown, the things they didn't have names for yet. And sleep came not just with stories or prayers, but with little acts of love. A quilt pulled up higher, a drink of water fetched after lights were out, a hand rubbing circles on a child's back. These were things no one talked about in the daylight but remembered in the bones. Even the act of blowing out the lantern held a kind of ceremony. The hiss of flame, the soft return to darkness, the way shadows folded around the room, tucking it in like a blanket. Sometimes, someone would light a single candle after the lamp was gone, not because they needed it, but because they were afraid of full darkness. That little flame meant you could see just enough, just one shape, just one face. And then, sleep, real sleep. Not the fear-sick kind, or the ragged, restless kind, but the kind that comes when someone has taken the time to soften the edges of the world. The kind of sleep where you felt seen, held, known, even if no one said a word. It happened in cribs carved by hand, in hammocks stretched under stars, in barns and wagons and lofts above shops, in the laps of tired parents who let their child fall asleep before they even noticed. It happened beside the fire with a book unread. It happened while brushing hair. It happened mid-song. It happened in the presence of love, always. And sometimes the adults needed it more than the children. A man falling asleep at the kitchen table, his wife placing a blanket over his shoulders, a mother nodding off while feeding a baby, the child's breath soft against her wrist, the body surrendering to the safety someone else made possible. Because sleep, in the Wild West, was not guaranteed, not easy, not constant, but when it came with gentleness, even just a trace, it was everything. And as dreams pulled them under, they carried those last sounds, the lullaby, the story, the whispered prayer, with them into the dark. Where stars might shine, where memories might return, where the world, for a few quiet hours, didn't ask anything more of them. And in those moments, they didn't belong to the Wild West. They belonged to something older, something softer, something eternal. And so, we end our story here. But not the sleep, not the slow drift into memory and breath. Let the darkness settle now. Let the day fall away. Let your eyes grow heavy like the lantern light fading. You are safe. You are held. You are part of the long quiet that connects us all. Good night, wherever you are, under one roof. Boarding houses, hotel parlors, and sleepless nights among strangers. Night in a frontier boarding house was a crowded sort of hush. The walls were thin, the hallways crooked, and the ceilings low enough that lantern smoke smudged them into permanent twilight. If a family cabin was sleep-pressed close by love, a boarding house was sleep-pressed close by necessity. A dozen heartbeats stacked on either side of you, each one tapping its own uneven rhythm against the dark. Imagine a two-story frame building warped by wind and age. The sign out front promises rooms, hot meals, good company, but room rarely means privacy. A single floor might hold 8 chambers rattling with iron bedsteads. The attic hides 3 more pallets pinned beneath the eaves. Beds are rented by the night, the week, or the hour. It takes a stagecoach to change horses, and every boarder carries a different reason for stopping. Drovers following a herd, seamstresses between employers, prospectors with pockets clinking or utterly empty. The jigsaw of stranger sleep. After supper, the landlady walks the corridors, lamp in hand, allocating bodies to mattresses like pieces of a puzzle. Married pair? Take the corner room if you don't mind the draft. Single lady? You'll share with Miss Perdue. She snores some, but she prays louder. Gentlemen headed north? 2 to a bed unless you can pay double. No one argues. They're too tired or too broke. Privacy is a luxury of the rich, and most travelers spend themselves down to their last coin long before they reach the next town. Men remove boots with a sigh, stuff socks inside to keep scorpions from crawling in, tuck pistols beneath pillows whether they plan to use them or not. Women unpin hair in the dark, careful not to let it brush a stranger's shoulder. There are introductions whispered after quilts are drawn, first names only, sometimes false, often forgotten by dawn. Noise, smell, and the geometry of shared breathing. Sleep here isn't silence, it's a symphony. Floorboards thudding under late arrivals, a cough turning into a rattle behind the wall. Someone pacing because they can't find the moon in a new sky. The sagging iron bedstead next door chiming each time a restless dream flips a body over. Smells mingle in the close heat. Saddle leather, coal smoke, laundry that dried too near the cook stove, lavender tucked into a widow's stays, hair tonics heavy with bay rum, sweat that never fully leaves even after a bathhouse scrub. Yet, amid the cluttered air there is a curious courtesy. People murmur sorry when their boots thump, tiptoe when they can, lift quilts slowly so cold air won't shock a bedmate back to waking. A practiced dance evolves through repetition. One turns left, the other turns right. Blankets slide then settle, breaths sink or politely stagger. Strangers learn the geometry of each other's bodies before they ever exchange a real story. Night watch in rotations. Because theft is easy when everyone's asleep, lodgers sometimes form informal watches. One man sits upright on the edge of the bed, repeating a psalm under his breath until the hourglass empties. Then he nudges the next fellow. Women share the practice too. A needleworker might darn stockings beneath a dim lamp while keeping an ear tuned for boots that don't belong. Little is spoken of it in daylight, but small nods pass over breakfast biscuits, acknowledging who kept whom safe. And yet, despite vigilance, things vanish. An ivory comb, a silver cufflink, a $1 eagle coin. Accusations flicker in morning eyes, but rarely cross lips, because no one wants a gunfight at dawn when the road already waits. Loss is chalked up to the cost of sleeping cheap, and life lurches on. Letters, Bibles, and the soft armor of the bedside. Every traveler displays one talisman at bedside: a neckerchief from home, a miniature portrait, a folded deed, a bullet clipped to a ribbon. They are boundary lines that say, "This slice of pillow is mine." One girl pins a scrap of lace over the headboard each night and removes it at dawn. A veteran places his hat on the blanket foot end so the brim points toward the window. He claims it keeps bad dreams heading out, not in. These tokens are the last thin armor between a heart and the anonymity of the room. Dreaming in foreign voices. Dreams in a boarding house are borrowed things. You might half wake to the murmured Spanish of a vaquero, or the lilting Gaelic of an emigrant widow asking God to find her lost son, and for a breathless second their language seeps into your own dream, tinting it with places you've never been. When morning bells clang for breakfast, sleepers rise feeling as though they've traveled while lying still. Some keep journals of these borrowed dreams. One traveling bookseller records snippets. Night 17, dreamt I was counting sheep in Yiddish. Must be the peddler in bunk above. Another woman sketches the faces she saw behind her eyes, gifting the drawings to their waking owners at checkout. Most politely decline, unsettled that a stranger's sleep could know their features so well. When death visits the upper hall, inevitably a night comes when someone doesn't wake. Consumption, a hidden wound, laudanum swallowed too heavy. The landlady lights every lamp, sends runners for the marshal and the undertaker. Meanwhile, boarders sit on stair treads wrapped in quilts, watching the door of that still room as if death might drift out like fog. Whispers weave. Did you hear a cry? I thought I heard a sigh just before dawn. No one admits to fear until breakfast, when chairs scrape slower and coffee tastes thin. By evening, beds shift. Strangers become wary again. But the room eventually fills. The road never stops delivering new dreamers with coins and secrets in their packs. Small mercies in a crowded night. Yet, kindness threads through these sleepless walls. A gambler lends his only spare blanket to a boy with fever. A laundress hums a lullaby until the baby of a passing widow settles. Bread crusts are shared with the silent trapper who spent his last dime on the bunk. These mercies bloom briefly, then vanish at dawn like candle smoke, leaving only a faint sweetness in the memory of those who received them. The hook that pulls us forward. But the strangest sleep of all was saved for those who crossed deserts on wheels. Rolling beds, rocked by ruts and rattles, dreams interrupted by the clang of harness chains. We'll climb into the creaking belly of a nighttime stagecoach and drift along moonlit trails to discover how travelers dozed sitting upright, lulled by danger and the relentless rhythm of iron on stone. Sleep in motion. Dreams. Inside the rattling belly of a stagecoach. It wasn't a bed, it wasn't even a cot. And yet, in the wild places between towns, where the moon rode low and the wind tangled in the sagebrush, sleep still came. Not the kind of sleep you fall into, the kind you bargain for. A sleep interrupted by wheels, jolts, footsteps, and voices. A sleep earned mile by mile, through dust and discomfort, inside the wooden ribs of a stagecoach. What if I told you people drifted off while crossing canyons and deserts, heads bouncing gently against window panes, feet tangled with strangers, pistols tucked beneath shawls, and that somehow, in that cramped and shifting world, dreams still arrived, like whispered guests, because the road didn't stop, and neither did the need to rest. Picture it. A stagecoach just past midnight, rocking through the Nevada scrub, its lanterns swinging like tired eyes on either side. 6 people crammed knee to knee inside, some silent, some sighing, The only steady rhythm, the clop, clop, clop of hooves and the rattle of wheels against stone. The windows are cracked open to keep the air from stifling, and through them the night presses in, cool, dry, and endless. The passengers lean against one another not from affection, but exhaustion. A man's hat dips low over his eyes, jerking upward every time the coach lurches. A widow rests her head against a young woman's shoulder. Neither knows the other's name. No one minds. Sleep in a stagecoach is shared. No blankets, no pillows, just your coat bunched behind your neck, or your hands cradling your face, or nothing at all. If you're lucky, you wedge yourself into a corner where your knees don't bump every time the road turns. If you're unlucky, you sway like laundry on a line, waking with every jolt, your body stiff and your head aching with the ache of half sleep. Outside, the driver and shotgun rider stay wide awake, calling softly to the horses, eyes scanning the dark for bandits, coyotes, or blown-out wheel ruts. They don't sleep, not ever. Their job is to carry the dreaming safely forward while the world behind them fades into stillness. Inside, time melts. Minutes feel like hours, and hours like dreams. People nod off in fragments. A minute here, two there, some mutter, some twitch, some wake up thinking they heard something. Maybe they did. Maybe they didn't. Stagecoach sleep was a bargain struck with fatigue. Take what you can, when you can, however it comes. And sometimes something strange would happen. A man might wake and swear he'd just spoken with his dead father. A woman might dream of snowfall in July. Someone would weep softly in sleep, a sound like wind on glass, and no one would say a word. Because when you sleep among strangers, you learn to leave dreams where they happened. And yet there was something beautiful in it. The shared surrender, the knowledge that everyone, no matter their name, their wealth, or the secrets in their satchel, needed rest. That for a few hours, even if the road twisted and the wheels complained and the coach door rattled like it might fall off, even then, people found sleep. And when the coach stopped, just before dawn, with lanterns dim and mountains sharpening in silhouette, people would blink themselves awake like birds at first light. They'd stretch, groan, adjust their hats, pretend they hadn't drooled or dreamt or leaned against someone they didn't know. And then they'd step out, into dust, into morning, into the long day ahead. Because that was the West. You slept when you could, how you could, where you could, and then you kept moving. But some of the most restless sleep wasn't on wheels or in bunkhouses. It came to those who couldn't stop remembering. We'll lie beside those haunted by old battles, past betrayals, and roads not taken, and explore how memory shaped the strangest dreams in the Wild West, the ones that never truly ended when the sleeper awoke, the dreams that wouldn't let go. Sleep in the shadow of memory. There are nights when sleep isn't rest at all, when the body curls into the blanket, but the mind won't settle. Out in the Wild West where silence stretched for miles and time moved like dust through fingers, some people didn't dream. They remembered. And memory, in the dark, was a heavier blanket than any quilt could ever be. What if I told you that in the soft hours before dawn, the toughest gunslingers and the gentlest wives both tossed in the grip of old stories? Stories that returned not through conversation, but through dreams they never invited, never asked for, and never learned how to forget. Because the land had a long memory, and so did the people. It might start with the twitch of a hand, a sigh barely audible. A man who once rode in the war wakes up in a cold sweat, whispering names no one nearby knows. A woman turns in her sleep, reaching for a child long gone, lost to fever or the journey west. A gambler who's never spoken of the duel in Kansas mutters through clenched teeth, as if his mouth still tastes smoke. These dreams didn't announce themselves. They returned in fragments. The color of a coat, the feel of blood, the sound of boots running away, the flash of someone's eyes in the firelight. And though daylight might bleach those memories down to something manageable, at night, the past took on shape and shadow again. In some cabins, people slept in separate beds not because of distance, but protection. One man, it was said, flinched so violently in sleep he once bruised his wife's shoulder. She forgave him, but built a straw mattress of her own beside the stove. "He doesn't mean it," she said. "It's just the old days knocking again." And then there were those who talked in their sleep, not just mumbles, but full sentences, speaking to people who weren't there anymore. One traveler said he'd heard a rancher whispering an apology to someone named Eli over and over, with tears running into his beard. No one knew who Eli was. The rancher never mentioned him in the daylight. The Wild West was full of fresh starts, but not everyone managed to outrun what came before. Some carried old wounds that never scarred over properly. Some carried guilt, heavy as a saddle. And sleep, for all its promise of peace, often brought those burdens up from where they were buried. Sometimes, dreams were sweeter. A girl might dream of her home back east, the garden, the porch swing, the sound of rain on the windows, and wake up crying because she'd forgotten the sound of her mother's voice until the dream returned it. A boy might see a horse he'd loved once, long gone, running through a green field with sunlight in its mane. These dreams hurt too, but gently. People had little ways of defending themselves from such ghosts. Some placed a pocket watch or handkerchief from the person they lost beneath their pillow, not to keep the dreams away, but to make them less sharp. Others wrote names on slips of paper and tucked them into their boots, like holding onto a piece of someone might anchor them in the waking world. And for some, sleep became ritualized protection. A line of salt under the bed, a Bible always open to Psalm 23, a lock of hair braided into a cord and wrapped around the wrist. They didn't talk about these things, but they did them, because it helped. Sometimes the best protection was presence, just knowing someone else was nearby. The way a hand on the back can calm a racing heart. The way hearing someone else breathe can remind you you're still here, still safe, still far from whatever it is that chased you in the dark. And there were those who couldn't sleep at all, who sat by the fire until the logs turned to ash, eyes red, pipe untouched, not afraid of the dark itself, but of what it brought with it. They'd nap during the day, a few minutes at a time, but at night they kept watch, as if by staying awake they could outrun the parts of their past that waited just behind their eyes. Yet, in all that heaviness, there was understanding. No one judged a man for waking up shouting. No one mocked a woman for sleeping with her back to the wall. They knew. They'd been there, or close enough to it. And sometimes that quiet acceptance was what allowed people to finally sleep. Because dreams aren't always chosen. But how we carry them, that was something the people of the West learned, night after night, whisper after whisper, breath after breath. And in the rare mornings when someone woke without memory, without weight, when the night passed smooth as silk and the dreams were light and distant, it felt like a kind of miracle, like forgiveness, like a chance to begin again. But not every sleeper dreamed. Some worked through the night, guarding, guiding, lighting the way. We'll walk with the night watchmen, the innkeepers, the lantern lighters, and all the people who stayed awake while the rest of the Wild West dreamed, keeping the dark at bay with footsteps, firelight, and faith, the ones who never slept. Watchmen, lamplighters, and the quiet guardians of the night. Sleep did not come for everyone, not because it wasn't needed, but because someone had to keep the fire alive. Someone had to walk the perimeter. Someone had to notice when a shutter blew open, or when footsteps approached from too far down the trail. In the Wild West, while most turned in for the night and pulled the quilts up to their chins, a few stayed awake, not by choice, but by duty. And because of them, the dark never fully took over. What if I told you that there were whole nights kept safe by men and women whose names were never remembered, whose jobs were never praised, but whose quiet presence turned fear into rest for the many? They weren't lawmen or legends, not gunfighters or ghosts, just steady hands, open eyes, and the willingness to walk when others slept. Some were watchmen, hired by ranches or towns to patrol after dusk. They walked with lanterns swinging, boots whispering in the dust, listening not for trouble, but for silence that didn't sound right. A broken rhythm in the crickets. A horse snorting too sharply. The click of something that wasn't wind. They didn't always carry guns. Some preferred a hickory cane or a dog with sharp ears. But their weapon was awareness. Their armor, routine. In tiny towns where everyone knew everyone, a single man might be trusted to walk the length of the street 4 or 5 times a night, peering into darkened windows, making sure nothing flickered that shouldn't. He'd tip his hat to the moon, tap the doorframe of the apothecary, check the hinges on the back gate of the schoolhouse. A ritual, a prayer in footsteps. And at sunrise, he'd leave a small chalk mark on the saloon wall. Proof the night had passed without incident. Others weren't hired, just appointed by time and need. The innkeeper's wife, for instance, who slept light because strangers came and went in the rooms above. She'd rise at every floorboard creak, wrap herself in a shawl, and peer through the crack in the parlor door until the noise passed. Not fearful, just careful. She had listened to too many stories over too many cups of coffee not to trust the night fully. And then there were lamplighters, those who made sure the wicks on the main street burned long enough to guide someone safely home. They moved at dusk, pole in hand, sparking the oil into glow, and sometimes, just before dawn, they'd make their rounds again, trimming, snuffing, whispering to the glass. Most never saw them, but their light became part of the rhythm, like stars nailed to wooden posts, holding back the dark just enough. Some watchmen kept journals, not for drama, but to record the weather, the temperature, what kind of moon they saw. One man in Wyoming kept a log for 5 years straight, 3:12 a.m., snow flurries, owl near the bakery roof. 4:09 a.m., someone crying softly behind the church. Didn't investigate. These weren't entries for fame, they were for continuity. Proof that someone was awake, noticing, breathing in time with the sleeping world. And what did they think about, these quiet guards? Some recited poems, others hummed hymns. Some thought of lovers they hadn't seen in years, or children growing up in cities they'd never visit. Their thoughts became the company that filled their shift, a shifting chorus of memory and hope and observation. They knew every scent the night carried. Rain on dry dirt, the sharp musk of passing coyotes, wood smoke drifting from a chimney just barely alive. They knew how to hear footfalls on gravel, on mud, on frozen grass. They knew when the wind had changed direction, not by feel, but by how it rustled the chapel roof. And yes, sometimes they got afraid. Everyone did. The sound of a bird startled into flight. The whisper of a child talking in her sleep. The slam of a gate unlatched by no visible hand. The night had 1,000 tricks, but fear was not failure. Fear was awareness. They weren't always alone. Sometimes two would walk together, sharing stories in low voices, pausing when they reached the end of one stretch, nodding at the moon like it was listening. Or a dog would follow, trotting silently, ears perked, tail swaying like a metronome. Once in a while, a child couldn't sleep and would sit by the window, watching the same figure pass the same corner every hour, like clockwork. And somehow that made the night feel smaller, safer. For those who stayed awake, the dawn arrived differently. Not like a gift, but like a soft letting go. The light didn't burst, it seeped. Into corners, onto rooftops, through lace curtains and barn slats. They'd feel it in their bones first. The cool change of air, the way shadows softened. And then the birds. Always the birds. They would return home, to a small cot, or a chair by the hearth, or a porch swing if the weather held, and finally close their eyes. Their shift done. They didn't expect thanks, they didn't need it, because they had seen the night through. And that was enough. And so, while the rest of the world dreamed, someone stood watch. Someone walked. Someone whispered to the flame. And now, we turn to those who heard the Wild West night from another place entirely, lying sick in bed, listening to the wind and waiting for sleep that might never come. We'll visit the bedsides of those who slept with fever, injury, or heartbreak, and learn what sleep meant when the body itself was the battlefield. Sleep when you're sick. Fevered nights and the stillness of pain in the Wild West. There's a kind of sleep that doesn't soothe. The kind that drags you under, not gently, but like a hand gripping your ankle and pulling you into the deep. In the Wild West, where medicine was a guess, and doctors were often hours too far, sleep during sickness became something else entirely. Not rest, but escape. Not comfort, but a flickering edge between waking and not waking. What if I told you that for thousands of settlers, sleep was the only medicine they could find? When the herbs ran out, when the whiskey didn't numb the ache, when the healer didn't come, they lay in beds too small, under quilts too heavy, hoping the dark would quiet the burning behind their eyes. And sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. Picture a narrow bed in the corner of a one-room cabin. A fire barely burning. A pot of water boiled down to steam. A mother wiping her son's forehead with a rag that's long since gone cold. A husband holding the hand of a wife whose breaths are too shallow to count. The house doesn't sleep on those nights. The house waits. Fever dreams came fast and strange. People spoke in tongues, said names no one recognized. One man, dying of snakebite, told the same joke again and again until his voice slurred into silence. A girl, burning with scarlet fever, reached out to catch snowflakes only she could see. The sick slept in fits. An hour here, 20 minutes there, and the dreams were deep, tangled, full of color and confusion. And those who watched them, they barely closed their eyes. They sat by the bed with a bowl and spoon, coaxing broth between clenched teeth. They whispered old prayers and made up new ones. They tried not to look too long at the sunken cheeks, the sweat-slicked collarbones, the eyes that didn't always open anymore. Sometimes someone slept not because they were healing, but because they were fading, the body's last kindness, to numb the pain with dreams. She's resting now, they'd say, even when they knew, even when the rest was final. But not all sleep during sickness was surrender. Some was stubborn. A ranch hand with cracked ribs would lie flat and still, willing himself to dream of galloping horses instead of broken ones. A child with croup would finally fall asleep to the sound of his mother's humming, the only lullaby strong enough to soften a cough. People believed that if they could just sleep long enough, deeply enough, they'd wake better, stronger, whole. And that belief was powerful. In the absence of medicine, hope was the prescription. A good night's rest could tip the balance, or so they believed. And sometimes they were right. Sometimes sleep worked where all else failed. The fever broke, the cough eased, the eyes opened clear. But even when healing came, it didn't come fast. Recovery in the West was its own long sleep. Days spent indoors, away from work, the world seen only through the window. People grew restless. Grateful, yes, but also haunted. "I dreamed the whole town burned down," one man said after pneumonia. "I dreamed my horse left without me," said another. These weren't just dreams. They were echoes. The mind's way of understanding the fight the body had just barely won. And for caregivers, sleep was a luxury stolen in minutes. A woman might nap in a chair with her hand still wrapped around her husband's. A father might doze on the floor beside his child's cot, waking at every wheeze. Rest came in scraps, in moments, in the half-light of dawn when things felt just steady enough to exhale. Still, there were small mercies. Warm water, a clean cloth, someone reading aloud from the Bible or from memory, the creak of a rocking chair that kept rhythm even after the words stopped. These weren't cures, but they were comfort, and comfort was often enough. Some homes had sickness so often that the bed itself seemed to remember. They called it the sick bed, a frame passed from room to room, slept in by sons with measles, husbands with wounds, mothers with failing lungs. It was cleaned, yes, but the memory lingered, and those who lay in it last often stared up at the rafters and wondered if they'd be the next one to stay there for good. And yet, there was resilience. People who rose after weeks of fever, bones weak as broom handles, but eyes sharp. People who took their first full sleep under the stars again after being inside too long. Who lay back in the wagon bed, looked at the sky and whispered, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, just to the night, because the West didn't give sleep freely. It had to be earned, bargained for, protected. And when it returned, real sleep, healing sleep, sleep without pain. It felt like a gift. But not every sickbed was in a home. Some were in jail cells, behind barred windows, or on the floor of a dusty tent. We'll step into the loneliest sleep of all, the sleep of the condemned, the outcast, and the forgotten, and explore what it meant to close your eyes when no one was coming for you in the morning. The loneliest sleep. Nights behind bars, in tents, and on the edge of goodbye. Not all sleep was gentle. Not all sleep was welcomed. And not every soul in the Wild West laid their head down in comfort, or even in hope. Some slept in cold cells with straw for pillows. Some under canvas alone where the stars looked more like judges than blessings. Some tried not to sleep at all, afraid of what might come, or what might never come again. What if I told you that the Wild West held more than just cowboys and settlers and soldiers? That there were drifters, outlaws, accused innocents, and broken men who closed their eyes knowing the morning might be their last? That sleep in those moments wasn't rest. It was surrender, or refusal, or something quieter and harder to name. Imagine a one-room jail in a dust-bitten town, the wood slats warped from heat, the single iron bar door groaning when the sheriff passed by. Inside, a man on a low cot, wrists raw from rope, hat long since taken. He turns his back to the wall and lets the dark press in. There is no pillow, no quilt. Just a coat bunched under his neck and the distant scent of last night's rain in the cracks of the stone. He doesn't pray, not anymore. But he does whisper someone's name, once, maybe twice, before the weariness folds him like paper. Sleep in jails came heavy, not because the beds were comfortable, they weren't, but because regret was exhausting. Some men slept like the dead because they'd fought so long to stay upright in the light. Others couldn't sleep at all, their minds replaying every step that led them to this cell, this silence, this waiting. And the nights were loud, not with noise but with thought, with mice in the walls, with the moan of timber cooling in the night, with the endless rhythm of your own breath, reminding you that you were still here, when maybe you wished you weren't. But jails weren't the only lonely places. There were tent beds, too. Not for prisoners, but for the dying. Makeshift sick tents outside mining towns and army forts where fevers spread faster than fire, and nurses wore cloth over their mouths. The sleeping bodies there weren't resting. They were waiting for the fever to break, or for the morning light to decide. No walls, just canvas, wind, and the sound of coughing, endless, overlapping human music too sad to write down. And yet, amid that hopelessness, people dreamed. One soldier wrote, before he died in such a tent, that he'd seen his childhood field again in sleep, the wheat so tall it whispered to him. Another said he heard his mother's voice, humming a hymn in a key he'd forgotten, soft as a warm hand. These dreams didn't save them, but they softened the pain. That was enough. Then there were those who slept with a noose waiting. The condemned, the judged, the outlaws who had run out of luck. Their sleep was the strangest of all, not just because it came before the end, but because it still came. People expected restlessness, pacing, madness, but many just lay down. They watched the moon through barred windows. They remembered the way a certain creek curved, or the smell of tobacco on their father's coat. And then they slept, not soundly, not sweetly, but deeply, because the body, even in fear, wants to rest, and the soul, when there's nothing left to fight for, often becomes still. A preacher once asked a condemned man if he feared hell. The man said no. What he feared was waking up just before the sun, and remembering he'd never see another one. He didn't. He died in his sleep. The sheriff found him curled on his side, face turned toward the light. But not all lonely sleepers were criminals or dying men. There were widows alone on ranches miles from anyone. There were drifters who'd burned every bridge they crossed. There were mothers with too many graves behind their house and not enough voices left to hush at bedtime. They, too, knew the weight of sleep unshared, the silence of empty beds. And still, they slept. Eventually. Not because it was easy, but because it was human. They dreamed of hands they once held, songs they once sang, rides they once took when the road felt endless. In sleep, they were never quite as alone, and when they woke, they did the hardest thing of all. They got up. Sleep did not fix the loneliness, but it gave them the strength to carry it a little farther. And even in the loneliest hours, someone, somewhere, was also awake. A lantern still burned. A dog still watched. The stars, silent but present, blinked their slow, steady reassurance. Because in the Wild West, sleep belonged to everyone, even those who thought it didn't. But not all sleep was heavy. Some was playful, innocent, full of yawns and questions and silly fears. Sleep like a child. Yawns, lullabies, and monsters beneath the bedroll. There was a sweetness in how children slept on the frontier, even if the world around them wasn't always kind. In the Wild West, where the days were long, the work was hard, and danger came wrapped in dust. Children still dreamed like children do everywhere, with wild colors, soft fears, and wonder that even the grown-ups couldn't explain. And when night came, they surrendered to it with the kind of faith that only the very young still know. What if I told you that bedtime on the prairie wasn't quiet? Not really. That it began with squeals, shouts, clattering pots, and last-minute sips of water. That the path to sleep was rarely straight, and almost always filled with a question, or 10. Because children didn't just fall asleep. They tumbled into it. Backwards, sideways, laughing. A typical frontier child, 6 or 7 years old maybe, didn't have their own room. They shared a straw mattress with siblings, or a blanket tucked into a wagon corner, or a simple ticking mattress stuffed with whatever the family had: feathers, corn husks, wool. A baby might be swaddled and tucked into a drawer. A toddler might curl up near the fire like a kitten. Older ones lined up like spoons in a drawer, toes pressed against each other's knees. They had chores, always. Bring in the kindling, sweep the floor, shut the chicken coop. But bedtime was still magical in its own quiet way. There were lullabies, yes, but also riddles and knock-knock jokes, whispered so fast no one could understand them. One child might hum nonsense songs while the others tried to guess what it was. Someone would always ask for just one more story. And someone, always, would delay sleep by needing one last thing: water, a kiss, a check for monsters. And oh, the monsters. Not fairy tale dragons, real ones, imagined from real places. A coyote with glowing eyes, a shadow that leaned the wrong way. The silhouette of a coat hung too carelessly on a hook. The creak of a wagon axle in the wind. These were enough to send a child burrowing under a quilt, whispering a plea into the dark. Don't let it find me tonight. Some parents humored them. Others told stories to scare the fear right out. That monster won't come because your older sister would knock its teeth out before it reached the door. Some made up charms: a lucky button under the pillow, a broom turned bristles up by the door, a smudge of ash rubbed behind the ear. Just enough to make a child feel strong before the dark pressed in. And then there were the dreams. Wild, tumbling dreams that only made sense to a half-asleep child. Dreams of flying horses, candy that grew on trees, rivers that ran uphill and carried them back home to a place they barely remembered. One boy dreamed every night of riding a buffalo across the stars. Another insisted a glowing bear lived in his pillow and told him bedtime jokes. No one argued, because the grown-ups, tired as they were, wanted the children to sleep. Even if that meant pretending not to see the imaginary friend climbing under the covers, or nodding solemnly when the child said, "The moon waved at me tonight." Some children fell asleep mid-sentence. Others lay awake counting ceiling boards. Some whispered to the dolls or carved horses they clutched like companions. There were no stuffed animals, but there were treasures: a pine cone, a bird feather, a folded scrap of fabric that once belonged to Mama's old dress. These weren't toys, they were tokens, anchors to keep the night from pulling them too far away. And in those fragile moments, when the cabin went still, and the fire dimmed, and the sound of crickets grew louder than voices, parents looked down at their children and whispered their own secret prayers. Let her sleep through the night. Let the cough not come back. Let the morning be easy. Because even the hardest man on the frontier softened at the sight of a sleeping child. And every mother, no matter how bone-tired, paused just one extra second to tuck in a curl, kiss a cheek, or adjust the blanket. And when the nightmares came, as they always did, someone was there. A hand on the back, a whispered, "Shh, it's not real." A light rekindled. A bed shared. Because no child in the Wild West ever had to face a bad dream alone. Not if love could help it. Even those with no parents, orphaned, fostered, drifting from town to town, found moments of rest in strange places. A church pew, a teacher's lap, a bunkhouse floor. Somewhere, someone would tell them, "Close your eyes now. It's okay. I'm here." And maybe that's what sleep meant most for children in the Wild West. Not safety, not peace, not even comfort, but presence, knowing someone was near, that if the monsters came, they wouldn't come alone. Because even in a world full of danger and dust, the greatest comfort wasn't a blanket or a lullaby. It was love, folded into the night, soft as breath and steady as heartbeat. But what if the night wasn't just a time to sleep, but a time to hide or run or survive?